Welcome to American History to Sleep To. This channel is designed to help you relax, unwind, and gently fall asleep while listening to calm, factual stories from the history of the United States. There's no need to stay awake. No need to remember names, dates, or details. If you drift off, the story will continue quietly in the background. Tonight, we'll begin at the beginning, with the slow and careful founding of the United States of America. Take a moment now to get comfortable. Let your breathing slow. Let your shoulders relax. As you listen, the pace will remain steady, soft, and unhurried. And whenever you're ready, we'll begin. Long before the United States existed, long before borders were drawn on maps, the land itself was already full of life. For thousands of years, Native American nations lived across North America. They built communities, developed traditions, and passed down knowledge through generations. Some lived near rivers and coastlines, others in forests, plains, mountains, and deserts. Each group adapted carefully to its environment, learning when to plant, when to hunt, and when to move with the seasons. Their societies were diverse and complex, with their own systems of leadership, belief, and trade. Life was shaped by the natural world. The movement of the sun and the changing of the seasons guided daily routines. Food was gathered, grown, or hunted with deep knowledge of the land. Shelter was built using materials found nearby, designed to provide warmth, protection, and comfort. Communities were often close-knit, with shared responsibilities and traditions. Stories were passed down through spoken word, carrying history, lessons, and cultural values from one generation to the next. Trade routes connected distant regions. Goods, ideas, and customs traveled slowly across the continent. These networks existed long before European ships arrived on the horizon. Different nations governed themselves in different ways. Some relied on councils of elders. Others followed hereditary leaders or chosen representatives. Decisions were often made through discussion, tradition, and consensus. Spiritual beliefs were deeply connected to the land. Rivers, mountains, forests, and animals held meaning beyond their physical presence. The natural world was not separate from daily life, but an essential part of it. When Europeans first arrived, they entered a world that was already established. A world shaped by thousands of years of history. A world with its own boundaries, relationships, and systems of life. The arrival of Europeans would slowly and permanently change this land. But before that change, before colonies and governments, before flags and borders, there existed a continent filled with living cultures, steady rhythms, and deep connections to place. This was the land before a nation. Life moved at a slower pace. Days were shaped by light and darkness. Work was done carefully, often by hand, with attention to detail and balance. Children learned by watching elders. Skills were practiced repeatedly, passed down through patience rather than urgency. Music, art, and ceremony were woven into daily life. These expressions helped preserve memory, identity, and meaning. Time was not measured by clocks, but by seasons, weather, and natural signs. Change came gradually. Growth happened over generations. The land itself remained central to every aspect of life. Before maps and borders, before written laws and distant governments, the land was understood through lived experience. Paths were walked many times. Rivers were followed carefully. Places gained meaning through use and memory. This long history existed quietly, steady, continuous, long before a nation would ever be named. The land remained patient. Seasons returned again and again. Life followed familiar rhythms, morning light, evening quiet. The passing of time without urgency, Generations lived, learned, and passed on their knowledge. Change came slowly, almost unnoticed from one year to the next. This long continuity shaped the land and the people together. Before borders, before governments, before the idea of a nation, there was simply life moving forward at its own pace. Calm, steady, unhurried. In the late 1500s and early 1600s, European exploration across the Atlantic increased steadily, driven by curiosity, competition, and the desire for new opportunities. Spain, France, and England all sought land, resources, and influence beyond Europe. Sending ships across the ocean to explore unfamiliar coastlines and establish claims. These early journeys were long and uncertain, often taking months to complete, with travelers facing storms, limited supplies, and the constant risk of the unknown. Over time, English settlements began to take hold along the eastern edge of North America, gradually forming small, scattered communities near rivers and coastlines. Life in these early settlements was difficult and unpredictable. Food shortages were common, disease spread easily, and survival depended on cooperation, persistence, and adaptation to unfamiliar conditions. Many settlers arrived with hopes of prosperity or religious freedom, only to discover that daily life required constant labor and resilience. Homes were built slowly, fields were cleared by hand, and supplies from Europe arrived infrequently. Despite these challenges, the settlements endured. As years passed, additional settlers arrived, communities expanded, and trade slowly developed between neighboring colonies and across the Atlantic. These early settlements would eventually grow into what became known as the 13 colonies. Though still connected to Europe, they began to develop their own rhythms of life, shaped by distance, environment, and necessity. This gradual process of settlement laid the foundation for everything that would follow. Over time, familiarity with the land increased. Settlers learned which areas could support farming and which were better suited for trade or travel. Rivers became vital routes for movement and communication. Small ports developed, connecting settlements to one another and to distant markets. Although these communities remained tied to Europe, the physical distance began to shape a sense of separation. Decisions were often made locally, based on immediate needs rather than distant authority. Slowly, almost without notice, a new way of life began to form. By the early 1700s, British colonies stretched along the eastern edge of North America, forming a loose and uneven chain of settlements from New England in the north to Georgia in the south. Though these colonies shared a common connection to Great Britain, they were shaped by very different landscapes, climates, and patterns of daily life. In New England, the land was rocky, and the winters were long and often severe. Farming was difficult, and families relied on small plots of land, fishing, and trade to survive. Communities tended to be close together, with homes clustered around central meeting places. Churches played an important role in daily life, serving not only as places of worship, but also as centers of learning, discussion, and community decision-making. Town meetings allowed residents to gather and speak openly about local concerns. Fishing and shipbuilding became essential industries along the coast. The sea provided food, employment, and a connection to distant markets. Ships carried fish, timber, and goods across the Atlantic, linking these small towns to the wider world. Life moved steadily, shaped by routine, shared labor, and deeply held traditions. In the middle colonies, the land was more fertile and the climate more moderate. Farms were larger, harvests more reliable, and agriculture became a central part of daily life. Grain crops such as wheat and corn were grown in abundance. earning the region the nickname the breadbasket. Trade routes expanded along rivers and roads, allowing goods to move more easily between farms, towns, and ports. Cities such as Philadelphia and New York grew gradually into busy centers of commerce. Markets, docks, and workshops brought people together from many different backgrounds. Merchants, craftsmen, farmers, and laborers lived and worked side by side. People from various countries and cultures settled in these colonies, bringing different languages, customs, and religious beliefs. This diversity encouraged tolerance and cooperation as daily life depended on exchange, negotiation, and shared effort. Across these northern and middle colonies, work filled most daylight hours. Families labored together, children learned skills early, and responsibilities were shared across households and communities. Despite the challenges of colonial life, many settlers developed a strong sense of independence. Distance from Britain meant decisions were often made locally, based on immediate needs rather than distant authority. Over time, this habit of managing daily affairs would quietly shape how colonists viewed their place in the world. Daily routines in these colonies followed the rhythm of daylight and seasons. Mornings began early, with work planned carefully around weather and available light. Tasks were often shared among family members, neighbors, and apprentices, creating strong bonds through repeated cooperation. Evenings brought quieter moments when households gathered indoors, fires were lit, and conversation replaced labor. Reading, storytelling, and reflection filled the hours after sunset. Over time, these routines created a sense of stability and familiarity. Life was demanding, but it was also structured, predictable, and deeply connected to place. This everyday experience shaped how colonists understood responsibility, community, and independence. In the southern colonies, the land and climate created a very different way of life. Warm temperatures and long growing seasons allowed agriculture to develop on a larger scale. Plantations spread across wide areas of land, focusing on crops grown for export rather than local use. Tobacco, rice, and indigo became valuable commodities, shipped across the Atlantic to markets in Europe. This system of agriculture depended heavily on the forced labor of enslaved Africans. Enslaved men, women, and children were brought to the colonies against their will and subjected to lives of hardship, violence, and control. Their labor generated immense wealth for plantation owners while denying basic freedom and dignity to those who worked the land. These realities shaped the social and economic structure of the southern colonies, creating deep inequalities that would persist for generations. Daily life in the southern colonies revolved around agricultural cycles. Work followed the seasons, with planting, tending, and harvesting requiring constant attention. Large plantations operated almost as self-contained communities, with fields, workshops, storage buildings, and living quarters spread across the land. Away from plantations, small farmers and tradespeople lived quieter lives, working smaller plots and serving local needs. Across all 13 colonies, daily life was defined by long hours of labor. Most people worked from sunrise to sunset, whether in fields, shops, homes, or along the docks. Leisure was limited, and rest was often tied to religious observance or the change in seasons. Travel remained slow and difficult. Roads were rough, journeys were long, and movement between colonies took time and planning. News traveled gradually, carried by letters, printed notices, and word of mouth. Despite distance and difference, shared experiences slowly connected the colonies. Local assemblies played an important role in colonial life. Representatives were chosen to discuss laws, taxes, and local concerns. These assemblies gave colonists practical experience with self-government, even while remaining under British rule. British authority existed, but it often felt distant and indirect. Over time, colonists became accustomed to making decisions locally, responding to immediate needs rather than waiting for instruction from across the ocean. This everyday practice of self-rule did not begin as rebellion. It grew quietly through habit and necessity. By the middle of the 18th century, the 13 colonies were no longer simply extensions of Great Britain. They were distinct societies shaped by land, labor, and shared experience. This growing sense of independence would soon be challenged as events beyond the colonies began to change their relationship with the empire. Over time, these local decisions became routine. Communities gathered to discuss roads, markets, schools, and shared responsibilities. Problems were addressed nearby by people who understood the land and the needs of their neighbors. This practical experience with cooperation and compromise shaped expectations about governance. Authority felt most legitimate when it was close and familiar. Distance made control feel weaker and less personal. Quietly, without formal declarations, many colonists began to think of themselves as capable of managing their own affairs. This mindset would soon influence how they responded to events beyond their shores. For many years, the American colonies remained closely tied to Great Britain. Colonists considered themselves British subjects connected to the empire through trade, culture, and shared identity. British laws shaped colonial life. British goods filled colonial markets, and loyalty to the crown was widely accepted. Distance from Britain was significant, but the relationship remained stable for much of the early colonial period. This balance began to change in the middle of the 18th century. Between 1754 and 1763, Britain fought France in a conflict known as the French and Indian War. The war was fought across North America, Europe, and beyond, with Native American nations involved on both sides. When the war ended, Britain emerged victorious, gaining control of large areas of land. However, the victory came at a high cost. Britain had accumulated enormous debt while funding the war. British leaders believed the colonies should help pay for their own defense and for the expenses of the empire. From Britain's perspective, this expectation seemed reasonable. From the colonists' perspective, it felt unfamiliar and concerning. Parliament began passing new laws and taxes aimed at increasing revenue from the colonies. The Stamp Act required colonists to pay taxes on printed materials such as newspapers, legal documents, and licenses. Later, the Townshend Acts placed duties on imported goods like glass, paper, paint, and tea. These taxes were not especially heavy by modern standards, but the principle behind them mattered deeply. Colonists had no representatives in Parliament. They had long been accustomed to taxing themselves through local assemblies. Now decisions were being made far away by people they did not elect. A simple idea began to spread through towns and cities: no taxation without representation. Protests followed, often peaceful at first. Petitions were written, meetings were held, and boycotts of British goods were organized. Merchants, craftsmen, and ordinary citizens participated, reducing imports and encouraging local production. Tensions increased gradually rather than all at once. British officials struggled to enforce the new laws. In some places, protests turned violent. In 1770, a confrontation between British soldiers and colonists in Boston resulted in the deaths of 5 colonists. This event became known as the Boston Massacre. Though small in scale, it was widely publicized and used as a symbol of British oppression. Relations continued to deteriorate. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, granting a British company special privileges in the colonial tea trade. Colonists saw this as another attempt to assert control. In response, a group of colonists boarded ships in Boston Harbor and dumped tea into the water. This act became known as the Boston Tea Party. Britain responded with harsh measures. Ports were closed, colonial governments were restricted, and British authority was strengthened. These actions were meant to restore order, but instead they deepened resentment. Many colonists began to question their place within the empire. They were still British subjects, but they no longer felt treated as equals. Trust eroded. Fear and uncertainty spread. What had once been a distant political disagreement was becoming a personal concern for everyday life. The relationship between Britain and the colonies had changed. It would not easily return to what it had been before. Daily life in the colonies was increasingly affected by these changes. Taxes influenced what people bought, how merchants conducted business, and which goods were available in local shops. Conversations about politics, once distant and occasional, became more common in homes, taverns, and meeting places. Newspapers carried arguments, essays, and letters debating the nature of rights and authority. Ideas traveled slowly, but once shared, they lingered. People began to pay closer attention to laws passed far away and how those laws shaped their everyday routines. Trust in British leadership continued to weaken. Officials sent from Britain were often viewed with suspicion, while local leaders gained influence and respect. Communities started to organize more closely with one another, sharing concerns and coordinating responses. What had once been isolated frustrations were becoming collective experiences. The relationship between Britain and the colonies was no longer defined by quiet cooperation. It was becoming defined by uncertainty, disagreement, and growing distance. The question was no longer whether tensions existed, but how they would be resolved. As tensions between Britain and the colonies continued to grow, resistance did not appear all at once. It developed gradually, shaped by shared concerns, repeated frustrations, and quiet organization. Colonists began to communicate more frequently with one another, exchanging letters, pamphlets, and news about British policies. Ideas traveled slowly, but they spread steadily. Committees of correspondence were formed, allowing towns and colonies to stay informed and coordinate their responses. These committees helped transform isolated disagreements into a broader, shared movement. Public meetings became more common. Citizens gathered in churches, town halls, and open spaces to discuss events and debate their meaning. Speeches were delivered, resolutions were passed, and collective decisions were made. Participation in these gatherings gave many colonists their first experience with organized political action. Printed materials played an important role. Newspapers published essays and arguments questioning British authority and defending colonial rights. Pamphlets were circulated widely, often read aloud to groups of listeners. These writings encouraged reflection rather than immediate action, shaping opinions over time. Economic resistance also expanded. Boycotts of British goods became more organized and widespread. Colonists reduced imports, relied more on local production, and encouraged one another to maintain shared sacrifices. Participation in these efforts required patience and cooperation, reinforcing a sense of unity. British officials watched these developments with concern. Attempts were made to reassert control through enforcement of laws and the presence of troops. Rather than restoring calm, these actions often heightened unease. The sight of soldiers stationed in colonial cities reminded residents of distant authority and growing mistrust. Despite rising tension, many colonists still hoped for reconciliation. They did not yet seek independence. Instead, they wanted recognition, fairness, and a return to familiar patterns of self-governance. Appeals were made to the Crown, expressing loyalty while requesting change. At the same time, preparations quietly continued. Militia groups trained regularly, storing supplies and practicing drills. These efforts were framed as defensive rather than aggressive, meant to protect communities if conflict arose. The atmosphere was one of uncertainty. Daily life continued, but conversations were shaped by questions about the future. People sensed that their relationship with Britain was shifting, though no one could predict exactly how events would unfold. Resistance was no longer limited to words. It was becoming a shared mindset, rooted in cooperation, awareness, and readiness. The colonies were moving toward a moment of decision, even if they did not yet fully realize it. In many towns, resistance blended quietly into daily routines. People continued their work, tended their homes, and gathered with neighbors, while remaining aware of the larger changes taking place around them. Discussions about rights and responsibilities became familiar, woven into ordinary conversation rather than reserved for special occasions. Over time, shared understanding replaced confusion. Colonists grew more confident in their ability to act together, to make decisions, and to respond collectively when challenges arose. This confidence did not come from sudden anger, but from repeated cooperation and mutual trust. The groundwork for larger action was being laid quietly, one conversation and one choice at a time. By the early 1770s, tensions between Britain and the American colonies had reached a fragile point. Years of disagreement, protest, and uncertainty had created an atmosphere of unease. Daily life continued, but it was shaped by expectation and quiet concern. Both sides sensed that change was approaching, even if its form was still unclear. British officials grew increasingly worried about colonial resistance. They viewed the spread of militia training and the storage of weapons as a direct challenge to authority. In response, British leaders decided to take action. Orders were given to seize colonial military supplies stored in the countryside near Boston. In April of 1775, British troops set out from Boston toward the nearby towns of Lexington and Concord. Their mission was meant to be swift and controlled. Instead, it became the moment when long-standing tension turned into open conflict. As British soldiers marched through the countryside, word of their movement spread quickly. Messengers rode ahead, warning local militia groups to prepare. Church bells rang. Signals were passed from town to town. By the time British forces reached Lexington, colonial militia members were already gathered. In the early morning hours, the two sides faced one another on a village green. No one knows exactly who fired the first shot. What is known is that gunfire broke the silence. The brief exchange left several colonists dead and wounded. The British troops continued on toward Concord, but resistance followed them. At Concord, militia groups confronted British soldiers at a bridge outside the town. More shots were exchanged. This time, colonial forces held their ground. As British troops began their return march to Boston, they faced continued resistance along the road. Militia members fired from behind trees, stone walls, and buildings. The retreat was exhausting and chaotic. By the end of the day, casualties had mounted on both sides. What had begun as a limited operation had become something far larger. News of the fighting spread rapidly across the colonies. Accounts were shared through letters, newspapers, and word of mouth. The events at Lexington and Concord shocked many colonists. For some, they confirmed fears that peaceful resolution was no longer possible. For others, they marked a turning point that could not be undone. Despite the violence, the situation remained uncertain. The colonies had not yet declared independence. Many still hoped conflict might be contained or resolved. But trust had been broken. Armed confrontation had occurred, and the consequences were impossible to ignore. The road to war had been crossed. The conflict that followed would reshape the colonies, their relationship with Britain, and the course of history itself. In the days that followed, the countryside remained tense and watchful. Militia members stayed near their towns, uncertain of what might come next. British forces regrouped in Boston, surrounded by growing numbers of colonial volunteers. Communities waited, listened, and prepared. News of the fighting continued to travel outward, reaching distant colonies and shaping how people understood the moment. For many, the events of that April morning settled lingering doubts. Armed conflict had occurred, and the path forward would no longer be shaped by petitions alone. The colonies had entered a new phase, one defined by consequence and commitment. The fighting that began at Lexington and Concord marked the start of a long and uncertain conflict. What became known as the American Revolutionary War would last for more than 8 years, testing the endurance, resolve, and unity of the colonies. At the beginning, few believed the colonies could succeed. Britain possessed one of the most powerful and experienced military forces in the world. Its army was well trained, its navy controlled the seas, and its resources far exceeded those of the colonies. The colonial forces, by contrast, were inexperienced and poorly supplied. Many soldiers were farmers, laborers, and tradesmen who had never fought in formal battles. They lacked uniforms, weapons, and consistent training. Despite these disadvantages, the colonies continued to resist. The Continental Army was formed to coordinate colonial forces. George Washington was appointed its commander. His leadership would become central to the war effort, not because of constant victory, but because of persistence. Washington faced enormous challenges. His troops often lacked food, clothing, and pay. Illness spread through crowded camps. Morale rose and fell with the seasons. Yet the army endured. The war was fought across a wide landscape. Battles took place in cities, along rivers, in forests, and across open fields. Control shifted frequently. Victories were often followed by setbacks. Neither side was able to secure quick or decisive success. For many colonists, the war brought disruption rather than glory. Farms were damaged. Trade was interrupted. Families were separated. Some colonists supported independence. Others remained loyal to Britain. Many simply hoped for peace. This division made the conflict even more difficult. Loyalists faced suspicion and retaliation. Communities were strained by disagreement and uncertainty. The war was not confined to the colonies alone. It became part of a broader global struggle. France, long a rival of Britain, began to support the colonies. French assistance included money, supplies, and eventually troops and naval forces. This support would prove essential. The presence of French ships challenged British control of the seas. Over time, the balance of power began to shift. Key moments changed the course of the war. Victories at places like Saratoga demonstrated that the colonial forces could defeat British armies. These successes encouraged further international support. Still, the war remained unpredictable. Years passed without a clear end in sight. One of the greatest tests came during the winter at Valley Forge. There, Washington's army endured harsh conditions, shortages, and suffering. Despite this, the army did not collapse. Training improved, discipline strengthened. The experience forged a more capable fighting force. As the war continued, exhaustion spread on both sides. British leaders struggled to maintain support for a costly and distant conflict. Colonial forces relied on endurance rather than overwhelming strength. Slowly, circumstances began to favor the colonies. The final major confrontation came in 1781 at Yorktown. British forces found themselves trapped by land and sea. French naval power prevented escape, while colonial and French troops surrounded the British army. After weeks of pressure, British forces surrendered. Though fighting would continue in some areas, Yorktown marked the effective end of the war. Negotiations followed. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain officially recognized the independence of the United States. The long conflict was over. The colonies had achieved what once seemed impossible. Yet independence brought new challenges. Victory did not erase hardship or disagreement. The task of building a stable nation still lay ahead. The Revolutionary War had secured independence, but the future remained uncertain. The story of the United States was only beginning. For most people living through the war, daily life continued alongside uncertainty. Crops still needed tending, homes still required care, and families adapted to long periods of absence and instability. Supplies were scarce, prices were unpredictable, and hardship became a common experience. The war touched nearly every part of colonial society, even far from the battlefields. Soldiers spent long stretches waiting rather than fighting. Camps were marked by routine, fatigue, and quiet endurance. Training, drills, and preparation filled the days, while letters from home brought comfort or concern. Loyalty remained divided. Some colonists continued to support Britain, believing stability would eventually return. Others committed fully to independence despite the cost. Many remained uncertain, focused on survival rather than politics. The war demanded patience more than speed. Progress came slowly, shaped by persistence rather than dramatic victories. Success depended on cooperation between soldiers, civilians, and allies. As the conflict drew on, exhaustion spread across the empire. British leaders faced rising costs and diminishing support at home. Maintaining control over distant colonies became increasingly difficult. When the fighting finally ended, the sense of relief was quiet rather than celebratory. Communities had been changed by years of struggle. Loss, disruption, and sacrifice left lasting marks. Independence had been won, but the work of building a nation had only just begun. The end of the war marked a transition, not a conclusion. A new chapter was waiting to unfold. With the fighting of the Revolutionary War finally over, the colonies faced a new and uncertain reality. Independence had been won, but what independence would mean in practice was still unclear. There was no single plan, no settled agreement on how the new nation should govern itself. Years of war had brought exhaustion, loss, and disruption. Cities and towns needed rebuilding. Trade routes had been interrupted, money was scarce, and debt weighed heavily on both individuals and governments. Many soldiers returned home to farms and workshops that had suffered during their absence. Families worked to restore a sense of normal life, even as the future remained uncertain. The former colonies were now independent states, each with its own laws, traditions, and priorities. To hold them together, a system known as the Articles of Confederation had been created. This agreement established a loose national government, intentionally limited in power. Most authority remained with the individual states. At first, this arrangement seemed appropriate. After years of resisting distant control, many Americans feared strong central authority. They valued independence, local decision-making, and freedom from concentrated power. However, problems soon became apparent. The national government lacked the ability to collect taxes. It depended on the states for funding, which often arrived late or not at all. Without reliable income, it struggled to pay debts, support the army, or manage shared responsibilities. Disagreements between states grew more frequent. Trade disputes arose. Borders were contested. Each state pursued its own interests, sometimes at the expense of cooperation. Without a strong central authority, resolving these conflicts proved difficult. Economic instability added to the strain. Paper money lost value. Prices fluctuated. Farmers and laborers faced hardship, while creditors demanded payment. Protests and unrest emerged in some areas, reflecting frustration and fear. These events raised concerns about whether the new nation could maintain order and stability. Despite these challenges, many Americans remained hopeful. They believed the problems could be solved through discussion, compromise, and careful adjustment. Ideas were debated in newspapers, meetings, and private correspondence. Leaders considered how to balance liberty with effective governance. The question was not whether independence had been worth the cost, but how to protect it. The early years of the nation were marked by experimentation. Mistakes were made. Lessons were learned slowly. There was no certainty that the Union would endure. Yet there was a shared understanding that something new was being attempted. The struggle was no longer against an empire, but for cohesion, balance, and durability. The next chapter would require careful thought, patience, and cooperation. The task of building a lasting government still lay ahead. Daily life moved forward as the nation searched for direction. People worked their land, reopened shops, and resumed trade, even as uncertainty lingered in the background. Conversations about government, authority, and responsibility became part of ordinary discussion. Communities reflected on what they had gained and what still needed to be built. The challenges facing the new nation did not demand haste, but careful thought. Decisions would need to balance freedom with structure and independence with unity. Many understood that lasting stability would come not from quick answers, but from patient cooperation. This period of uncertainty was not a failure, but a necessary step. It allowed ideas to settle, priorities to emerge, and lessons to take shape. The future of the nation was still unwritten, waiting to be shaped by thoughtful design. By the mid-1780s, it had become clear that the young nation needed change. The system created under the Articles of Confederation was no longer sufficient to meet the country's needs. Economic instability persisted, disputes between states continued, and the national government remained too weak to respond effectively. In 1787, delegates from the states gathered in Philadelphia to address these concerns. Their original goal was modest. They intended to revise the Articles of Confederation and strengthen the existing system. What followed, however, would reshape the nation entirely. The meetings took place behind closed doors. Delegates agreed to keep their discussions private, allowing them to speak freely and explore ideas without outside pressure. This secrecy encouraged honest debate, careful listening, and gradual compromise. Representatives arrived with differing priorities. Large states favored systems that reflected population size. Smaller states feared being overwhelmed and sought equal representation. Some delegates emphasized strong national authority. Others remained cautious, protective of state power and local control. Debate was constant and often intense. Proposals were offered, challenged, revised, and reconsidered. Compromise became essential. One of the most important agreements reached was a balance between state and population-based representation. This resulted in a two-part legislature. One chamber would represent the people directly. The other would represent the states equally. This structure helped ease fears and allowed progress to continue. Another major concern was the concentration of power. Having recently resisted a distant authority, delegates were wary of creating a government that could become oppressive. To address this, power was divided among three branches. The legislative branch would create laws. The executive branch would enforce them. The judicial branch would interpret them. Each branch was given limits, along with the ability to check the others. This system of checks and balances was designed to prevent any single part of government from becoming too powerful. The convention also addressed the relationship between the national government and the states. Certain powers would belong to the federal government, such as conducting foreign affairs and regulating trade between states. Other powers would remain with the states. This division was intended to preserve local authority while ensuring national unity. The process was slow and deliberate. Weeks passed as language was refined and details were adjusted. Delegates weighed the consequences of each decision, aware that their work would shape future generations. Not all delegates agreed with the final document. Some believed it granted too much power to the central government. Others felt it did not go far enough. Despite these differences, a majority recognized the need for a workable system. In September of 1787, the Constitution was completed and signed. It did not take effect immediately. Instead, it was sent to the states for approval. Public debate followed, marking the beginning of a new phase in the nation's development. The work of building a government was not finished. It was entering a new stage. As the convention came to a close, delegates reflected on the weight of their work. They understood that the Constitution was not a perfect document, but a carefully balanced one. It was designed to endure, not by resisting change, but by allowing it through lawful means. The choices made in Philadelphia reflected both caution and hope. Caution born from experience with distant authority. Hope rooted in the belief that cooperation could create stability without sacrificing liberty. When the delegates returned home, the discussion continued. Citizens read the proposed Constitution, debated its meaning, and considered its implications for daily life. The future of the nation now rested not with a small group of delegates, but with the people themselves. The decision to accept or reject the new framework would shape the country for generations to come. Once the Constitution was completed in 1787, its future was far from certain. The document did not take effect immediately. Instead, it was sent to the states, where it would need approval through a process known as ratification. Each state held conventions to debate whether the new framework of government should be accepted. Public discussion intensified. Newspapers printed essays, letters, and arguments on both sides. Meetings were held in towns and cities where citizens listened, questioned, and reflected. The debate was thoughtful and, at times, deeply concerned with the balance between liberty and authority. Those who supported the Constitution became known as Federalists. They argued that a stronger national government was necessary to provide stability, manage the economy, and protect the nation from external threats. They believed the Constitution offered safeguards against tyranny through its structure and limits on power. Those who opposed the Constitution were often called anti-federalists. They feared that the new government would become too powerful and distant from the people. They worried that individual rights were not clearly protected. Their concerns were rooted in recent experience with British rule and a desire to preserve local control. The debate was not about rejecting government entirely. It was about shaping the kind of government that would best protect freedom. In response to anti-federalist concerns, Federalists made an important promise. They agreed that amendments would be added to protect individual liberties. This assurance helped ease fears and encouraged broader support for ratification. Gradually, state by state, the Constitution was approved. In 1788, enough states had ratified the document for it to take effect. The new government was set to begin. True to their promise, leaders moved quickly to address concerns about individual rights. In 1791, 10 amendments were added to the Constitution. Together, they became known as the Bill of Rights. These amendments guaranteed fundamental freedoms. They protected freedom of speech, religion, and the press. They ensured the right to assemble and petition the government. They established protections for the accused and limits on government power. The addition of the Bill of Rights reassured many who had feared the reach of the new government. It clarified that liberty was central to the nation's foundation. With ratification complete and the Bill of Rights in place, the basic structure of the United States government was established. It was not perfect, and it was not finished. But it provided a framework designed to endure through change. The nation now had a system shaped by debate, compromise, and careful design. The early chapters of American government had been written. What remained was the long process of living within that system and allowing it to grow over time. The debates surrounding ratification left a lasting impression on the nation. They demonstrated that disagreement could exist without division, and that compromise could strengthen rather than weaken a shared purpose. The Constitution and the Bill of Rights together reflected careful thought and restraint. They acknowledged human limits while aiming to protect human dignity. Over time, these principles would guide laws, institutions, and daily civic life. They provided a foundation that could adapt while remaining grounded in core values. The work of ratification did not end discussion. It began an ongoing conversation about liberty, responsibility, and balance that would continue across generations. As the story of early America settles, there is nothing more you need to follow. No dates to remember. No names to hold on to. The long journey from distant colonies to a new nation unfolded slowly, shaped by patience, uncertainty, and careful choice. What began as small communities grew through shared effort. What emerged through debate and compromise became a system designed to endure. And now, that story can rest. You've listened quietly as events moved from one moment to the next, without urgency. There is nothing left to understand or resolve. The past can remain where it is, steady and complete. If your thoughts begin to wander, that's perfectly fine. If sleep has already begun to take hold, the sound will continue gently in the background. Your breathing can slow. Your shoulders can relax. The work of the day is finished. American history will remain here, calm and patient, whenever you return. For now, there is nothing left to do. Just rest. The story does not need to move forward right now. It can remain still, settled, complete. You've followed it far enough for this moment. The rest can wait. Let the voice remain steady. Let the sound become part of the quiet around you. There is no need to listen closely. No need to stay awake. Everything important has already been said. You can allow the day to fade. Rest now. The sound will continue calmly beside you. There is no moment you need to catch, no place you need to arrive. The story continues quietly without asking for attention. Time moves gently here, like seasons returning, like familiar paths walked again and again. The past settles into a steady rhythm. Events unfold, then fade. Ideas rise, then rest. Nothing demands focus. Nothing needs to be remembered. Breathing moves in and out, slow and even, each moment passing without effort. The sound remains constant, soft, unchanging. If your thoughts drift, they can drift freely. If sleep deepens, the voice will remain calm and steady. There is no beginning here, and no ending, only continuity. Like pages turning slowly in the background, like light changing outside a quiet window. History does not rush, it waits, patient, unconcerned, steady. The sound may repeat, but it does not change, and it does not need to. You can remain exactly where you are, comfortable, safe, at ease. Nothing else is required. Just rest. Time moves gently here, like seasons returning, like familiar paths walked again and again. The past settles into a steady rhythm. Events unfold, then fade. Ideas rise, then rest. Nothing demands focus. Nothing needs to be remembered. Breathing moves in and out, slow and even, each moment passing without effort. The sound remains constant, soft, unchanging. If your thoughts drift, they can drift freely. If sleep deepens, the voice will remain calm and steady. There is no beginning here, and no ending, only continuity. Like pages turning slowly in the background, like light changing outside a quiet window. History does not rush, it waits, patient, unconcerned, steady. The sound may repeat, but it does not change, and it does not need to. You can remain exactly where you are, comfortable, safe, at ease. Nothing else is required. just rest. The story continues quietly without asking for attention. Time moves gently here, like seasons returning, like familiar paths walked again and again. The past settles into a steady rhythm. Events unfold, then fade. Ideas rise, then rest. Nothing demands focus. Nothing needs to be remembered. Breathing moves in and out, slow and even, each moment passing without effort. The sound remains constant, soft, unchanging. If your thoughts drift, they can drift freely. If sleep deepens, the voice will remain calm and steady. There is no beginning here, and no ending, only continuity. Like pages turning slowly in the background, like light changing outside a quiet window. History does not rush, it waits, patient, unconcerned, steady. The sound may repeat, but it does not change, and it does not need to. You can remain exactly where you are, comfortable, safe, at ease. Nothing else is required. Just rest.